Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments at the top here for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Michael Koresky presenting his new book, Films of Endearment, A Mother, a Son, and the 80s Films That Defined Us. He'll be talking with Mark Harris, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Michael, Mark, and the team at Hanover Square Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your support for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Films of Endearment, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Michael's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Mark Harris. He's the author of Pictures at a Revolution, 5 Movies and the Birth of the New Hollywood, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. 5 Came Back, A Story of Hollywood in the Second World War, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. And Mike Nichols, A Life, which was published in February. He's written for many publications, including the New York Times, Time, GQ, and Grantland, and is currently a writer for New York, where he often covers the intersection of culture and politics. He lives in New York City with his husband, Tony Kushner. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Michael Koresky. He's a film critic, screenwriter, and editorial director at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City, where he also oversees the acclaimed Film Comment magazine. Previously, he was the manning editor of the Criterion Collection. He's been named one of the 100 most influential people in Brooklyn culture by Brooklyn Magazine. His new book, Films of Endearment, is a poignant memoir of family, grief, and resilience about a young man, his dynamic mother, and the 80s movies they shared. Michael is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Mark and with all of you. Michael and Mark, please take it away.
Well, thanks everyone. Thank you for coming out to support Greenlight Bookstore. And thank you for coming out to support this beautiful piece of work, this warm-hearted and insightful and funny and moving book by Michael Koresky, Films of Endearment. Michael is going to do a quick reading from the book for us, after which I'm going to ask him some questions, and I hope you'll chime in with your own in the Q&A module. But before the reading, Michael, I just want to ask you, the subtitle of the book is A Mother, a Son, and the 80s films that defined us. But tell us a little bit more about the premise of this book before you read.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much for being here, Mark. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Greenlight Books. This is really amazing. It's a dream come true. And it's certainly a dream come true having you here, Mark. You're an inspiration to me. Your books have been influential. I'm amazed by you. So thank you for doing this. It really, really, really means a lot. You asked me a question, though?
I did. What's your book about?
The hardest question you possibly could have asked. The book is about my mother. The book is about me. The book is about taste and how it's formed and why it is what it is and where it might come from. All questions that I'm not actually able to answer, I think, ultimately. But the general idea is that upon discovering that my mother felt the same way I did about 80s movies, which is that she thought of it as her favorite decade of film, which is, it's sort of funny to film people to think that, because it's usually disparaged as kind of, it's like in between the great 70s and the 90s. It's when Blockbuster was king. It's when these uber masculine films were champions of the box office. So once she told me that in this kind of casual conversation that we were having, I realized that the films that are so meaningful to me that she'd introduced me to had a much more profound effect on my life than I ever realized. So we embarked on this project to go back in time and to watch one film per year from the 80s, which is my idea. I think I'm very rigid in my thinking. It's like we have to have one film per year. And what I realized is that by picking one film per year, each one had a theme that would bring out something about my mother's life that I didn't know. And I have a strong relationship with my mother. We have like a friendship, but at the same time, a parent and a child never really know that much about each other when it comes down to it. So this was a way of getting at some emotional truths and some realities and some ideas that I never thought about before. So I'm not really good at just sitting down and talking about, my emotions, especially with my mother. But if I have movies as the anchor, as the launching point, then perhaps I can get at some of these ideas. So movies were the tool, in a way, the conduit to get to some of this. So that's the basic premise and structure of the book.
Great. So let's hear from an early part of it, and then we'll talk.
Okay. So this is from the first chapter after the introduction. It's 1980 Work. Dumb-witted broads. It was a phrase that thankfully I hadn't heard before, and I may have quickly forgotten it, if not for my mother, who wasn't going to allow such words to pass through the ears of an impressionable 6-year-old without letting him know that it was quite a terrible thing to say. The insult is muttered angrily about 2/3 of the way through 1980s slapstick dark comedy 9 to 5. It's directed at the film's triumvirate of sympathetically vengeful heroines played by Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, and Lily Tomlin, by their misogynist prick of a boss, Franklin Hart, embodied by the expertly mustachioed Dabney Coleman. At this point, he has been nearly poisoned, fired at with a pistol, kidnapped, tied up, and held hostage in his own house. But at that gendered taunt, Leslie drew a line. She turned to me on the couch and said, "Michael, that's a really bad thing to say." The movie's centrality to my childhood and its unconscious shaping of my awareness of the world's gender inequities, as well as its giddy, endless rewatchability, made it the perfect starting point for the cinematic journey upon which I was embarking with my mother. The voracious, sponge-like minds of children crave repetition, and 9 to 5 was one of those films that, in the ascendant VHS era, I watched over and over. To the point that I had memorized some of the dialogue, and certainly Dolly's earworm title track. My mother, on the other hand, hadn't seen it in decades, possibly not in its entirety, since she first showed it to me. It was a cold January afternoon when we revisited 9 to 5 together for the first time in more than 30 years. Dirt-caked, iced-over remnants of a snowfall from the previous week crusted the ground outside, and we could still see white glistening on the frozen, spindly branches of the oaks that surrounded the family room, a space that gets a lot of natural light. If it's a movie afternoon, we often have to lower the shades to avoid sun glare on the television. Today it was mercifully overcast. We clutched mugs of tea. Sometimes we'd supplemented our hot drinks with a cookie or two. This time I needed a free hand to scribble into a notebook any thoughts that might come to my head. I was used to taking notes during screenings for movies I was going to review, not during the joyous comedies of my childhood. Would such a film as 9 to 5 hold up to analysis and scrutiny? What was I really looking for? One thing I did want to discover, I wondered if my mother would respond to the dumb-witted broads line the way that she had decades ago. As it turned out, she let the scene play without interruption. Perhaps a man nearing 40, I didn't need parental guidance. Afterward, I asked her about that line, and she told me she didn't remember making a big deal out of it, but it was a big deal for me. It's fair to say that 9 to 5 was morally instructive to me as a prepubescent kid. Its antagonist was repeatedly called a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. And though those words formed a rather pleasant supercalifragilisticexpialidocious-esque timbre when strung together, I had surely never heard at least 4 of those words before. Nevertheless, they were entirely legible. As I learned the words, I also was learning how not to act, how not to treat others, how not to speak to and about people, and specifically, to dare not disrespect women. 9 to 5 was my first exposure to the concept of feminism, years before I would learn about the socio-historical depths of the term, what the struggle for freedom and equality meant and has continued to mean for women, the office drudgery and marginalization that Fonda's Judy Burnley, Parton's Doralee Rhodes, and Tomlin's Violet Newstead had to overcome in 9 to 5 told a different story about the joy of catharsis, of screwing over a boss who was always trying to screw over or just screw you. As with all the potent female movie stars my mother presented to me at a young age, she seemed to identify with Fonda, Parton, and particularly Tomlin, with her take-no-guff demeanor. I knew nothing of the established personas of these 3 stars. I just knew they seemed to get what they deserved, a little dignity and a little respect, as Violet triumphantly puts it at one turning point. I grew up in a household with a dominant maternal figure who voraciously read books and kept track of finances and did the shopping and cooked the meals and wrote articles for the local paper and was an active member of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters and performed in local theater when she somehow found the time. It was only years later I would appreciate the fact that she was the only woman in a house with 3 males and that none of this necessarily came without a considerable amount of emotional balancing. While never domineering, my father boasted a 6'2" frame that made my mother's 5'1" stature even more diminutive, so that she had to sometimes shout over the noise to be heard. We often thought my mother, her now gray hair once a fiery red, had a short fuse or a temper. God help the man, inside or outside the family, who dared to tell her to calm down. I'm gonna stop there.
You know, Michael, I was listening to you read this passage and I was thinking that so much of your professional career has been devoted to helping people see movies in kind of perfect conditions in a way, and you know, with the Criterion Collection or with some of the showings that you've curated, you know, you're really making it possible for people to see movies as they were meant to be seen. And yet in this passage you talk about the glare off the TV screen, and it was such a great reminder to me that most of us who grew up loving movies did not see them under optimum lab conditions. And I imagine that, you know, you saw a lot of cropped movies. We didn't have widescreen TVs when you were a kid. So how was it sort of seeing revisiting these movies under kind of the same imperfect conditions of your childhood?
Well, except that everything is now at least letterbox, so you can see the whole screen.
Right.
That's a big change, right? The size of TVs. That's a really interesting question, especially because one of the most formative experiences that I had at all growing up was when my mother showed me 2001: A Space Odyssey. Clearly not a film from this book, not from the 80s, doesn't have a strong female protagonist. But she showed that movie to me when I was about, about 6 or 7, and I was so overwhelmed by it. I remember just weeping at the end, and even though I didn't know what the hell was going on, but that was mercilessly cropped, like everything we watched. You did not get the full experience that you would get with that film, but it still had an emotional effect. So because I was so affected by cinema, even if it wasn't being shown in optimal conditions, I felt like going back and doing this project would maintain the same emotional parameters, I guess. I felt there were certainly changes, emotional changes that I had gone through, and things that looked and felt different to me, but it all felt kind of like, the same emotionally, in a way. Like these movies were turning points for me, each and every one of them, and they stayed that way.
I don't know if it's is it giving too much away? Say so if it is. Just say what the 10 movies are. Do you want that to be a surprise, or can we tell people? Can we tell people some of them?
Yeah, I can go through some of them because each one has such a different emotional tenor, and each one is able to extract so much from us after watching them. And each one is so meaningful in its own way.
And as you said, each one of them has a strong female protagonist, and although the genres range from comedy to melodrama to stage adaptation to science fiction, all the women are human. Like it's a very human scale curated collection of movies. And one thing I was wondering was, you had to kind of curate this list of 10 a few different ways at once. Like, as you said, only one per year, and it had to be in chronological order. And I imagine that you were trying to hit a bunch of different types of movies, and you were also trying to find movies that had a particular resonance for your mother and for you. So how tricky was it pulling this list together?
That's an interesting, the thing, and I need to say this, and because this book is trying to do, maybe it's trying to do too many things, I don't know, because it's doing multiple things. I think I forgot to mention up front, and I'm glad you brought it up, the importance of movies with strong female protagonists that helped shape my consciousness and my movie love. That is a very central thing here. And in going back and reading about that and rediscovering these films, I realized that the 80s was kind of like a lost paradise for this, right? We've all heard the phrase, not enough good roles for women. And certainly people in my generation have been hearing it since probably the 90s. Going back to the 80s, you realize that these were studio films, some of them with large budgets, and women were being given, rich, thought-provoking roles that were not about, wearing miniskirts, right? And they were women in their 30s and 40s a lot of the time. And so this is really an interesting era, right? When studios were financing these films. It was still a male-dominated, male-driven era, as it still is, of course. And almost every film that I've chosen is directed by a man. But in a lot of the cases, these women are like the auteurs of their own films, and in a couple cases, produce these films themselves. So it's really important to keep in mind that, like, the strength of the women isn't just like I went back and I found like the one in each year that I thought would work, but that I'm charting an era of filmmaking that I think is important. And I think it's important for that reason. So I actually had a lot to work from. It wasn't like, oh, I guess in 1987, I'll pick this one because there's nothing else. There was so much to pick from. And if you tried to do this project from a different era, from a later era, at least, or from the one right before, the 70s, good luck to you. I wanted to hit certain beats, but I also I wanted the films to guide it. So it wasn't, if I was dedicated to structuring the book based on the films, right? I could have written this in any other way. I could have decided that I want to start with this idea about my mother and then work through her past this way and then talk about myself in this way. And we'll end on this emotional note. We'll do it this way. I decided to kind of trust the concept and let the films guide it. So the book has kind of like an emotional crux halfway through. Like it doesn't build to its most emotional scenes. It happens in the middle. And that was just coincidence, right? That was just the way that the films worked. And I started to really like that that randomness, and it kind of felt like the randomness of life, right? Like the Terms of Endearment chapter, which is the 1983 film, was the hardest for me to write because it's about my father's death and his sickness and my relationship and my mother's relationship to that and my relationship to my mother through that, and how that was all, how the rewatching the film Terms of Endearment brought that back out. So if that had come first or last, I think the book would be very, very different, right? And then a movie like Baby Boom, which is the 1987 title, it comes at a point in the book where I'm able to talk about, yes, women in the workplace and mainstream concepts of feminism like the 9 to 5 chapter had, but I also am able to take it to the next level and talk about my thoughts around parenthood and my relationship to my mother as a parent and what that means and how I feel about my own future and my own mortality. There are just ways within each chapter to touch on certain things, and I'm able to kind of loop around as much as I can, but keep it within a tight framework. So I really need those strict parameters. And I think I answered your question way too broadly, and I can't stop talking.
No. That was great. And it gave me a follow-up, which is, I'm wondering if the 1983 chapter you said was the hardest for you to write for personal reasons. I'm wondering if Terms of Endearment was also the hardest movie to write about, or was there another movie that just in terms of writing about the movie itself was particularly challenging?
That's an interesting question. Yes, I think in terms of the personal, Terms of Endearment was hard. And I knew that going in because it was even hard to watch because my mother wouldn't have wanted to watch that movie again. It was too much of an emotional wallop. And she hadn't seen it in decades because it's just, the way she talks about that film is so interesting because no one really knew when it came out that it switches gears from comedy to tragedy about 3/4 of the way through. So you leave feeling so depleted by the end of that film. And it starts out like a sitcom, basically, a good sitcom. But in terms of like the movie itself, what was the hardest to write? I think The Color Purple was probably the hardest to write, which is probably the film that I've seen the most out of all the movies in the book. I watched that a lot growing up. I'm not sure why, but I have like basically memorized. It's this cathartic experience I like to have every so often because I find it so emotional. But also I wasn't entirely sure, what I would connect it to. I feel so strongly about it as an aesthetic object and as an artistic statement and as a beautiful work of humanity that I felt like I was going to shortchange it no matter what. And so I had to find a way in. So I'm not sure I ever got to say the things about it that I wanted to say because I kind of centered that chapter on a different sort of metaphor, which is about books and bookshelves and reading and the life of the mind. So that was hard. When
you were talking about the premise of the book, you mentioned the fact that the 80s are sort of a degraded era, particularly studio movies from the 80s in current film discourse. They're not the 70s and they're not the 90s, and probably if one were to go on Twitter and do a search, of the 10 movies that you chose, probably only Aliens is one that gets kind of discussed by people who busily make lists of the 100 best whatever, or there's also a way in which studio movies about women still, even 3 decades later, kind of aren't talked about very much or taken seriously as something that we should look at as movies. And did you feel in some way that you were fighting to pull this kind of movie back into the conversation?
It's interesting. Once you just get going on a project, you're just, I'm sure you know this so well. You think almost shark-like. How do I get through this? How do I get to the end of this? And then let the ideas fall where they may, sort of thing. But yes, I did start to have those conversations with my husband. Like this starts to feel kind of like a reclamation of this era, and I've heard that from people who have read it. I've never thought about these movies seriously, and I know I come from I'm deeply enmeshed in a cinephile world where you know, we don't talk about baby boom. You know, we don't really talk about Crossing Delancey as much as we should. We don't talk about the Fabulous Baker Boys. And because film history has been so long written by kind of male film nerds, a lot of these films are not treated with the proper respect. You look at the IMDb, that horrible thing, like the IMDb top 20, top whatever films, it's all the most, you know, masculinist things you could ever imagine, right? It's like always like, it's always those movies, right? Shawshank Redemption, Star Wars, 12 Angry Men. It's always the same movies. You do not see All About Eve on there, really, even though All About Eve is, you know, one of the great films of all time. And if you go back and look at, say, the Oscars, for example, if you want to talk about the Oscars as some sort of barometer, which of course they are, as you wrote so brilliantly in Pictures of the Revolution, because they're a cultural reflection. If you look back at those, how many Best Picture winners can you name that are about women? Terms of Endearment is one of them.
Right.
All About Eve is another.
And then it gets very thin.
I know there are some, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really moved me about your book and about the list that you pulled together was, and you're never blunt about this, but these are the kinds of movies that you're sort of told in a heteronormative world that as a little boy, they're not the movies that you're supposed to like. Again, except for Aliens, the movie that gets a free pass in every conversation. But so to me, your book also felt like it was a reclamation in that way of what's okay for us to look at and what's okay for us to talk about, because obviously, like, the connection of gay men with movies with strong female protagonists is really a profound thing, and one that doesn't get explored in a lot of film conversation, except through, you know, memes and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I you know, explicitly talk in one of the chapters about, you know, my queerness, my homosexuality in relation to in relation to one particular film, but it's threaded throughout the whole book, right? Because it's also about identification. It's not just that these films were, you know, these anomalies or these interesting movies about women, and hey, isn't that interesting? Like, I was identifying with the characters in these films. I really always had a very hard time identifying with male characters growing up. So, you know, my brother, who also loves movies, but he you know, he tends to gravitate towards more traditional masculine films, and I watched those growing up and I enjoyed them. And I you know, RoboCop's a great movie. It's brilliant, right? But am I going to watch it 20 times, 30 times? Or am I going to watch The Color Purple 20 times, 30 times? Because I'm more interested in the emotional inner lives of the people on screen. And I needed that identification. I didn't feel like as a I wouldn't have been able to put this into words then, but as a incipient gay child growing up in the 80s, I didn't really have anything to look at other than women, because I was looking for a certain kind of sensitivity, right? And you didn't normally get that with male-fronted films. I mean, this is the era of Ghostbusters, right? Like the ultimate in kind of irony, right? Like male irony drenched, above it all blockbuster filmmaking. I'm not saying it's not fun. I'm not saying I did enjoy it, but you know, looking back, I realized that I was looking for that identification with women. You know, I loved Dirty Dancing. I loved it. I watched it over and over and over again. And well, we all did as a family, because it's a Jewish family, and Jewish families. In fact, anybody who came into the house, my parents would like put the Dirty Dancing tape on. We taped it off HBO, and they forced everyone who came through the doors to watch your Dirty Dancing, which is great. But you know, it wasn't like I was. I realized, ooh, I'm in love with Patrick Swayze, and I was like, it was Jennifer Grey. Like I was. Right. I thought that she was amazing. I loved watching her. I realized that I was like identifying with her, right? Or Elizabeth Shue. I mean, I just loved her. I loved Madonna, not as an actress. But I loved watching. I had my standards. Okay.
Can you talk a little about I mean, you make it look easy, but writing about your own mother and making her a vivid person and even a character to people who have never met her before must have been an incredible challenge. I mean, how much in the front of your mind was, am I getting her right?
Well, she's a real character. I'm sure she's watching, so she'll. I don't know if she'd
Hi,
agree.
Michael's mom.
So there's that. That makes it easy. But yeah, no, it was a challenge only because I'm not. It's not really my mode for the most part, right? Like I often don't even like to bring the I voice into my writing. You know, I'm a critic. I look at other things. So this was a challenge all around to talk about myself, but to talk about my mother especially, is it's mostly about her. And I mean, I have to give credit to my editor, John Glynn, who's watching, who really helped, dig deep, help me dig a little bit deeper, and also Farley Chase, my agent, who was like so good at helping me shape these ideas. So I needed help in bringing that out, and I credit them for that. But once you get into that mode, of thinking of a person you love as a character, it does free you up a little bit. It really does. Like, oh, I can make her as interesting to other people as she is to me. That's really exciting and liberating.
I want to remind people to please put your questions in the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many of them as we can, but at first I'm going to ask a few more. And one of them is, you just touched on this, but all books change from the thing that we think they're going to be on the first day we start them. And I'm wondering if for you were surprised by anything, and I'm particularly wondering, were you surprised by the degree to which you ended up having to write about yourself? Did you see that coming?
Yeah. No, I did not see it coming. And I realized that again, like with the guidance of very smart people, that would have to be more a part of this project. It's one thing to write about an era of filmmaking that you want to reclaim. And it's one thing to write about your mother and try to dovetail those two things together. But if you don't, those things don't work unless there's the connecting glue. And I guess I found out that was me. So now I have to deal with everyone I know knowing a lot more about me than they used to, which is a little scary. But no, it's yes, it was a bit of a surprise. It's interesting. I hadn't really written in that way until I wrote this film comment article a few years ago, before this, that was about this magazine, Films and Filming, which is a British film magazine that, anyone who is a little queer, you can tell instantly that this was like edited and formed by gay men in the 60s. So it was a British magazine that started in the 50s, and it went through to 1980. And when the magazine started, homosexuality was outlawed in England. So everything had to be very, very under the surface, any kind of intimation of homoeroticism. And I was fascinated by this magazine. Even before I was out, I would see copies of this magazine in the film comment offices where I had been working right after college. And then I saw it at the Criterion offices, because they would keep these really precious out of print old magazines. And I was just fascinated because it's so homoerotic. It was crazy, the things that they put on the covers. So I wanted to investigate this and find out what the deal with this magazine was. And I wrote a feature on it for Film Comment magazine that went back into the history of it. And that was a great research project. But in writing it, I realized that I can't really talk about this if I don't bring myself into this article a little bit, because my discovery of its homoeroticism and my kind of awareness of coming to terms with my own homosexuality are completely entwined. So that was a barrier that I had to cross, right? My ability to even deal with that, to even dare talk about myself in writing. And that led me to this a little bit. I found it was a little more comfortable for me to do it, and led me to this. I certainly don't want it to become my only mode moving forward. People will get sick of me real fast. But yeah, it worked for this. But it's really about my mother. It's really about her. And I learned a lot.
I want to ask, and this is, I think maybe this is a question about both you and your mother. You mentioned that you had seen The Color Purple a lot over the years, but of the movies that you included, was there one that maybe you hadn't seen in a really long time? Like what, maybe there's two different answers here for you and or for your mother. What was the movie that most surprised you upon revisiting it?
Well, the one I could say the one that surprised her the most, and probably also me, was the Robert Altman movie "Come Back to the Five and Dime," Jimmy Dean, which is probably the least known movie in the bunch, and I hope that it gets people to find it. And actually, we're going to be showing it. We're going to be screening it at Metrograph, so it's going to be available soon, and I'm going to be doing an intro with two really terrific critics, Caden Gardner and Willa McClay, and we're gonna have a little conversation about it. So it's probably I don't want to say the strangest film of the bunch, because it goes in and out of time, and Altman films are always a little less mainstream, I guess, than other films. And his filmmaking is so connected to the 70s as opposed to the 80s. It feels more like a 70s films from 82. But the reason that I chose that movie is because I remember my mother renting that movie and bringing it home and just being I was mesmerized by it. I'd never seen anything like it before. And the central one, Sandy Dennis is in it, and Cher. In Cher's first starring movie roles before Silkwood. And Karen Black, the great late Karen Black, plays a trans woman. And it's a beautiful piece of acting, and it's a beautifully sympathetic portrait. And it led to really fascinating discussions between us. My mother forgot the movie completely, right? It's an interesting thing. When you're an adult, you watch something, it's one of the many things you watch and it goes out of your brain. When you're a child and you absorb something so striking and rich, it stays imprinted on you forever. And that movie was like that. So revisiting that with her was really powerful. And it also gave me a chance to think a little bit about my queerness in relation to cinema and to women on screen, how that queerness is related to women. So that one for sure.
That's really interesting. We should talk a little, well, there's so many different things I could ask you, but one thing I don't want to let go of is that, despite the title, which really does make it clear that the characters are you and your mother, and in many ways these movies, your father is also an important part of this book. He's the dedicatee, and he's really a presence throughout its pages. So I wonder if maybe you would want to say a little bit about him and about like what, if anything, was his relationship to your movie rearing?
That's a good question. Obviously, it was a less direct and emotional connection in terms of movies, but my dad was someone who loved things so much. He's not someone who could rattle off movie titles or, he wouldn't say like, here are my 10 favorite films. He didn't think that way, but he loved everything, right? He loved, and I mentioned this in the book, and because it was such a thunderbolt moment for me. When he died, his best friend gave a eulogy in which he just listed off the things that he loved. He loved the cats. He loved ice cream. He loved taking walks. He loved cars. He was obsessed with cars. It was his biggest, he loved motorcycles. He loved movies. He loved TV. He loved this, he loved Seinfeld. He loved everything, right? And that kind of love, that kind of enthusiasm that he had is part of, I think, who I am. I think that was passed down to me, even if it's not specifically about film. There were films that he loved, and we would go to see films on his business trips, for example. One of the things, my dad was a traveling salesman, so when I would go with him on trips to Maine and Connecticut, and he sold eyeglasses to optometrists and opticians, and we would stay in motels, which was the most exciting thing in the world to a kid. And we would go to the movies at night, just the two of us. And we would always see the movies that my mom didn't really care about, right? So we would see the junk, things that didn't ultimately have a big lasting impact on me, but Con Air or Braveheart. one of the worst Best Picture winners. But they created like a whole other world. So there was that like separate world. And I'm not saying that my dad only liked masculine films. He didn't. One of his favorite movies was Little Women, the 1994 best Little Women. He loved that movie. He loved it so much. So he didn't have like this kind of strict, I watch guy movies, my mom watched girl movies. That's not what it was. But, you know, he just had this kind of like love for all things. So that's how I would typify his relationship with me in movies. And yeah, it was sad that part of him went away.
You know, one thing the book reminded me of is that as much as we would sometimes like to curate a kid's taste, you really can't do it. And during those formative ages, you have to kind of let them find what they find and love what they love. And it sounds like both of your parents in different ways, nobody was saying, oh, these are the movies that you have to see, you know, if you want a film education. They just let you kind of rove around in what you were interested in, what they were interested in, and you found your way to what you love.
Yeah, I think that's true. Was that, I'm just curious because I love asking people about their relationships to movies through their parents. Did you have a similar relationship with, did your parents love movies and did they introduce you to things?
My father really loved movies and he introduced me to a few things, but you know, I grew up in the 70s when it just wasn't possible for a parent to curate their kids' taste unless something happened to show up on TV. I think for parents who want to be control freaks about their kids, it's way easier now because you can pick exactly what you want them to see and exactly when you want them to see it. And I didn't have that at all. I mean, my father took me to really good movies in the 70s and I loved that. But also I grew up on seeing local station airings of movies in New York City that aired at 4:30 in the afternoon and were chopped to bits and were terrible prints and were broken up into two parts. Like it didn't stop me from loving movies for a second. So
well, I still had a little bit of that in even though the 80s were, like you're saying, they were the VHS era, and my mother loved, that's why the reason she loves the era is because she could now bring movies home on the weekend to share with the family, curate films, right, for the family. But there was still television with commercials in the 80s. So a lot of what I saw was like the 8 o'clock movie with commercials that would run for 3 hours. And I have a lot of fondness for that time.
We're going to go to questions from your Zoom attendees in a second, but I want to ask you one more thing, which, I mean, this book, one of the really great things about it that I want readers to know is that you can do a slow read of this if you want, and pretty much find most, if not all, of the movies on some streaming service or another along the way if you want to watch it that way. But if you do watch all 10, you'll get this really beautiful suite of movies, but you will also, I guarantee you, have a longer watch list of things that these 10 movies will make you want to watch. And so I'm going to ask you to violate your one movie per year policy and pretend for a second that the 1980s had 12 years. And like, give us 2 movies that just missed the cut that you still would have had a good time writing about.
Okay, I will say one that's pretty well known and one that's not well known at all, and because they were both things that I thought about. One is The Witches of Eastwick, 1987 movie with Cher, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Susan Sarandon. I just absolutely adore that movie. I watched it a lot growing up. It would have been really fun to write about that movie, but it didn't bring out an idea or a theme in terms of my relationship to my mother. So it's why I went in a different direction. And I do mention in the book that I almost picked that. That was an extremely fecund year for great 1987 for female driven films. And then another one, because I watched this not long ago with some friends, because I remembered my mother loved it as a kid. It's called Violets Are Blue. It's a 1985 or 86 movie with Sissy Spacek, who, again, one of the problems here is that I can't cover everything. And Sissy Spacek is like one of my favorite actresses ever, right? I just adore Sissy Spacek, and I wasn't able to write about her. It just so happened that none of the movies fit into the scheme of the book. But there's this really fascinating movie, little tiny movie directed by Jack Fisk, who is her husband, who's also the art director on, on David Lynch films, on Terrence Malick films. And he also had a really interesting career making these small female-driven films, mostly starring his wife, back in the 80s. And it's called Violets Are Blue, Kevin Kline and Sissy Spacek and Bonnie Bedelia in a kind of a love triangle in this small coastal Carolina town. It's just smart. It's just a smart, well-directed, funny, moving little movie starring Sissy Spacek as a very strong-willed, interesting, full-fledged protagonist. She's a photographer who comes home and rekindles a relationship with her married lover from high school. It's just smart. It's just really well done. And no studio would ever make a movie like that now. So I highly recommend people find that nice little movie.
It was notable to me that I think I'm right about this, that you didn't repeat actresses, that
was another thing. Yeah, no, I didn't want to repeat it.
Conscious of that.
Yeah. It's because each chapter I get to go into a little bit about their careers and their biographies. So I didn't want to have to go over them again, I guess.
And no Meryl Streep. So
no Meryl Streep.
Are you 100% sure you're gay?
Okay, I'll tell you one thing. My husband and I, about, 10 or plus years ago, decided to watch every Meryl Streep movie in order, in case you were wondering how gay we are.
Okay,
so
good. I'm taking off my glasses to see some reader questions, and here's one that I'm sure a lot of people have, which is, has your mom read the book? And if so, what was her reaction?
Yes, she certainly has read the book, and the main reason that she read it earlier than anybody is because I had so much that I had to fact check with her, right? I'm writing about her life. I'm going into her past. I'm writing about her family. I'm writing about her life in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and her mother, her complicated relationship with her mother, and so many different threads about her working career. So I had to double check. And of course, I send this off to her and I think, oh, man, like, look at the job that I did. Look at no mistakes here. And it was like riddled with errors. So she had to fix all of those. But yes, of course, she loves the book, and she says that she's very proud. So, I mean, she better be, right? Imagine if she hated it. Talk about a target audience.
Then she'd have to write her own. Here's a question from the wonderful Ella Taylor. And I think this is a really sharp, a great question that only a sharp critic would ask. Is there a movie that you consider pretty terrible, aesthetically speaking, and yet speaks so truly to something in your felt experience that you never forget it? And she says, in my case, Ordinary People, which is a 1980s movie.
Oh, wow. That's a really fantastic question. I don't think any of these films are aesthetically terrible. Though I have this kind of love-hate relationship with Mommy Dearest, which I write about in the chapter. Is it the worst movie or is it the best movie? It's a fascinating film. There are some unforgettable things in it. The performance is kind of mesmerizing, even if it's bad. Or who knows if it's bad or good. And there's all kinds of like problems with the films, all sorts of mistakes, but I wouldn't call it aesthetically poor. So, man, it's a really, really, really good question. I mean, there must be, right? So now I'm going through the.
I guess go through the discards. Like, what did you not do just because you thought I love this movie, but it's too bad for me to make the case for in a book? Like, was there a movie you were worried you'd be shamed for loving?
Oh my God. It's such a good question, and I want to answer it. I really, really want to answer it well. I think there was. Wait, if Chris is watching, maybe he can pop up in the chat. There was something that I was like, I think I remember saying something like, "Ugh," but I can't write about that movie. What was it? Oh man. I mean, it's funny. Your aesthetic. Your critical and aesthetic fine-tuning skills. No, I love the question, Ella. They graduate with you, they grow with you, right? So I remember starting to become more aware of the badness, the potential badness of movies when I was a little bit older. Like when I went to college, for example, that's when I started watching movies that I just hated them so much. And I think part of that's, you're in college and you're trying to kind of be better and more and fine tune that. But God, I think I just blindly liked everything in the 80s. So I go back and think again. I mean, I wouldn't want to disparage anything.
Here's a question that Nicole asks.
Wait, I have an answer. I don't think Steel Magnolias is a very good movie, but I really, 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 really love it. And I think that it is very meaningful to me. There you go.
There you go. Well done. Here's a question from Nicole. Are there any films from today that remind you of these films from your childhood?
Films from today? Ugh.
Woman in the Window?
Well, I've heard that's just dreadful. I haven't actually watched it. It's sad that I would say I would mostly say no. I would say no, unless something can kind of pop up and someone can remind me if there's something. But these types of films were an endangered species even then, and now they just feel completely gone. Everything is just has like a streaming service likeness, sameness to it. There's kind of an anonymity to a lot of what we watch, a lot of the same aesthetics, and I find that kind of alienating. I don't mean to be a crank. I don't want to turn into, say it's only good when I was a kid. People are coming up with 20th Century Women. That's an interesting one. I really, really, really liked that. Thank you, Gretchen. 20th Century Women was a terrific movie with Annette Bening. Really liked that. Hope Springs, that was an interesting one that came up too, which is a street movie from about, I don't know, I guess less than 10 years ago. That was a really interesting movie. Certain Women is a great film, but it does not remind me of anything that I saw when I was young. I mean, it's just, it's Kelly Reichardt film. It's so aesthetically daring. So
this is a really nice question from Matt Stowe, who asks, have you been able to watch a movie with your mother in person since the pandemic started? And if so, what was your first choice?
This is interesting. So it was just was Mother's Day last weekend? Mother's Day a couple of weeks ago. We went and visited her because if people have read the book, they realize that doesn't quite end the way I expected. So my husband and I went up there to visit her last weekend, and we watched Love Affair, which is the 1939 Irene Dunne, Charles Boyer original that An Affair to Remember was a remake of. So and I prefer it actually. I'd seen it before, but it had been a while. And that story, it's the cliche, in Sleepless in Seattle, when they're always talking about how the women always cry during An Affair to Remember. I understand that it does get to me, but Love Affair, the original, I think it's because it's Irene Dunne. I love Irene Dunne so much. That one really gets to me. I find that a real shot to the heart. So we watched that. So it wasn't an 80s film. It was something from before both of us were born.
Here's a good question that I was wondering about. This is from Ina Archer saying, did you watch your favorites beginning to end, or did you replay favorite scenes over and over, or switch between movies? In other words, were you in a sense re-editing the films? And this was something I was curious about. Like, did you have a rule for the way you would watch a movie?
Like do you mean when we would do the actual, when we sat down to watch them?
Yes.
We definitely watch them straight through, no stops. And I'm very surreptitious when it comes to note taking. So I would have my book over here and write little notes so she wouldn't see and I wouldn't interrupt the experience or disrupt the flow. There were no other rules other than, try to cut down on bathroom breaks and make sure that the lamp is turned off so it's not glaring off the television. I mean, they're just, right. I know that a lot of people kind of, they stop movies a lot now, right? That's kind of, I think that it's just a reaction to the way that we live now, but people watch movies in chunks. So no, we watch them straight through. But then I went back after when I was writing the chapters and I would watch them again and watch parts and watch scenes because, you know, I just wanted to get certain things right and get the flavor. And some of the films have, you know, the DVDs have commentaries and things. So there's a lot of reasons why you would go back and do a lot of research. I'm sure you know from your writing that you have to watch things kind of over and over again.
Right. Well, one thing I'm curious about it, for this experience for you, is I'm sure you watched all of these movies over and over again in the course of, you know, doing the book. But did you pre-watch them, or did you let the watching with your mother be the kind of first revisitation?
Oh, always the first. Always the first. Yeah, no, I did not revisit that. I mean, and it's like you asked me that, and I think, well, of course, but it's actually a good question. No, I did not. Wouldn't even have thought to do that. The idea is that we were rediscovering these films together. Some of them, like Baby Boom, we've seen so many times that it doesn't even matter. We may have watched that anyway, and one of our nights, but then come back to the Five and Dime. You know, we probably wouldn't have watched together. So I wanted to keep those experiences pretty fresh, and whatever surprises came, let them come.
Here's a question from Andrew Chan, who asks, since this is the most personal writing you've ever done, were there any memoirs or personal essay writers who inspired your approach or gave you inspiration?
Oh, yes. I mean, man, right before, well, I mentioned Edmund White in the book a little bit, but so there's him. But then once, not long before I started writing, I read Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, which blew my mind. Highly recommend anyone to read that. That's a story about, man, I can't even say what it's about, but it deals with the writer's identity as a queer parent and her marriage to a trans male partner. And I was so moved and astonished by the alacrity with which she moves between tones that I was it was one of those things where, like, oh, I'll never be able to write like this, and I hate myself while I'm reading this. But nothing inspires me more than great writing. So I would say that was probably the primary thing that inspired me. Just amazing.
There are so many people who have great questions, but I think we only have time for a couple more. So I'll ask this one from Christopher Davis. Are there films you and your mother watched during those years, whether they're included in the book or not, that you had widely different opinions about? Were there, or are there any disagreements on films between you and your mom?
It's a great question. There's a little bit of that in the Baby Boom chapter, only because I felt like I had a kind of a different political response to the film over the years. Like I loved it as a kid, started to think it was suspect as I got older, politically suspect, and kind of dealing with my own response to it. And then by the time I revisited with her, I thought, okay, this movie is really dubious, right? The way that it represents motherhood, and the way that it represents feminism in the workplace, and because it was a highly criticized movie. Also, I discovered upon researching it, but my mother never had those issues with the film. And talking to her about it, I realized that I had sort of like an academic response to it. So that resulted in a really good conversation. In terms of a movie that that she really likes that I don't, I think she liked not from that era, but I think she liked The Shape of Water, which I really hated. We have to get into that.
We've two sort of related "what are you doing next" questions. One person who asks, do you have an idea for another book, and another person who asks if you're going to curate more of Queer Sighted.
Oh, yes. Well, so Queer Sighted is the series that I program for the Criterion channel. And yes, as a matter of fact, I just recorded the next conversation, and I'm very excited about that series. And that's going to be going up in June. So it's actually really soon. So I'm very excited about that. So that'll be the 4th edition of that series. And that's if anyone has the Criterion channel, you can see it. The idea is that it looks back through cinematic history through a queer lens, whether it's queer films directly with queer characters or queer themes, or queer subtext, which is so often the case when we talk about queerness throughout film history. So yes, that's a really exciting series coming up, and I probably can't reveal much more about it. But I also have a really great conversation partner in that one, so I'm excited about that. In terms of writing, I'm always writing something or trying to write something. I have my ideas in terms of books, but I also want to just get back to writing a little more short form criticism, because I haven't been doing as much of it as I would like. It's tough. It's tough to find time. It really is.
And oh gosh, I guess I've hit our time limit, but so I gotta ask this last one. Ryan Tresser says, what did Michael do with all of the film reviews he wrote as a kid up in his bedroom? Did he share them at dinner?
I wrote a lot when I was a kid. I wrote horror stories and movie reviews. That's all that I cared about as a kid. And so I just wrote and made lists. I mean, any film geek writes lists, endless lists. So I think my drawers in my desk were just full of stories and lists. And then at a certain point, I remember my aunt and uncle bought me a little book that had my name on it, like printed on it, and it said Michael's movie reviews, and it was alphabetical, and I was able to start writing them down. So that was really helpful. And then when I was in high school, my mother encouraged me to go talk to the local newspaper in my town, Chelmsford, the Chelmsford Independent, which isn't so independent anymore. And I called them up and said, can I be your movie critic? So I started writing for the town newspaper, actually, from my junior and senior year of high school, and that was great. So those actual printed reviews from when I was a teenager exist in newspaper form somewhere.
I'm going to hand this back to Greenlight Bookstore now, but before I do, I just want to say, you all know this because otherwise you wouldn't be here, but I can't recommend this book highly enough. It is a really insightful, as Michael said, reclamation of a set of movies that really deserve it. It's a great piece of sustained film criticism. It's also a really warm and beautiful memoir and the story of a family, and to get those two things together in one book is such an extraordinary treat and a privilege. And so please buy this book. Please tell people about this book. All books depend on people like you who love books to go give them a life. And we're so appreciative that any of you are thinking of doing that. So thank you, Michael, so much for your incredibly insightful and thoughtful answers, and for your magnificent piece of work here. And good luck with it.
Thank you, Mark. That was, I'm blushing and I'm touched, and I'm so happy that you did this. You're gonna kill me for saying this, but like, I read Mike Nichols' A Life. I devoured it. It was one of the most purely enjoyable experiences I've had during this entire thing. Like this past year, there wasn't a lot of joy. That book brought me nonstop joy. It's so brilliant. So I highly recommend people read that. I know that you're going to say that was ridiculous, but
I'm just going to Venmo you some money, like we said.
But thank you for being here. This was really, really special and meaningful to me.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Michael and Mark, for an incredible conversation, and thank you to everyone who spent this time with us tonight and shared this space for conversation and connection. A reminder that you can buy Films of Endearment at Greenlight Bookstore. If you're local to Brooklyn, we're open noon to 7 for limited capacity browsing every day of the week. Or you can find the buy link on our website in the chat. I'll paste that there again. And you can buy for local pickup, in-store pickup, or shipping anywhere in the US. Thank you so much again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Chelsea.
All right.